Okay, hello and welcome to round 7 of the BlitzFuel Invitational 2025. As we saw in the first 6 videos, we were entering this round with an even score, 3 out of 6, which wasn't bad. I think it was probably a fair score for how I had played in the first 6 rounds. There were definitely reasons to be disappointed. I left a lot of points on the table, or at least a lot of points that I considered myself having left on the table, especially in round 5, where I lost a virtually winning position. But there were also a couple games that could have gone either way. A couple of my wins could have certainly been at least more complicated, if not fully turned around. So, 3 out of 6 was probably a reasonably fair score. That did mean that I knew going in that this back third of the tournament was going to sort of determine whether this was a good or bad event. It kind of reduces the 9-round tournament down to a three-round event, which is much higher variance. And at least for me, these last 3 rounds of a long 9-round tournament are typically where you really start to feel the length of the event. A lot of open tournaments, especially the ones that you play as like sort of local events between like super serious stuff, don't even go this long usually. There's a lot of like 5-round, 6-round tournaments. And even the like 7-round tournaments and 9-round tournaments that are these like larger opens, you sort of ramp into the difficult games. Rounds like 1 and 2, sometimes even 3 in some of these larger fields. They're so difficult games, you often are made to work for it by, 2021, like much weaker players that are still quite good. And oftentimes they take points off you. I mean, it's certainly not like a cakewalk, but it is definitely, it takes a lot less out of you a lot of the time than playing, a strong title player every round like these 9-round round robins. And so round 7, 8, 9, I definitely start to feel the fatigue, which to some extent is mostly, making excuses. It's really not that big a deal, but it does have some effects. Like I do try to play a little bit simpler in the last few games, knowing that my calculation is going to be a little bit shot. It's kind of the first thing to go when you're tired. So I'll often, choose openings appropriately, just sort of try to play something simpler. And so in this game, where we were playing against young international master Nico Chasin, I've had several games against him in the past. Actually, I've had quite a good score in the past, though I probably shouldn't. I think most of the positions I had gotten were really quite bad, but somehow I managed to eke points out of them. So I had a lot of games against him before, so I sort of knew what to expect in the opening. He's one of the only players that I know of that makes the time on off Sicilian work, and that has been his main weapon for many years. So I wasn't sure if he was going to go for that or something else entirely. I knew he had played the Sveshnikov earlier in this event, and everyone in this event is sort of strong enough to play any major opening, so I mean, I wouldn't have been shocked to see even like an e5, a c6, like really anything, even a French. But I did expect that he would stick to the Sicilian at least. And then this is where I figured there might be the main branching point. Knight c6 and e6 he's played against me at different times in the past, sort of trying to dance around the possibility of me going for c3 and instead of the immediate d4. So when he played knight c6, I wasn't particularly surprised. I did go for d4, and here I thought both moves were possible, either e6 going for the time on-off, after which I had prepared some not very challenging line, just trying to get a sort of some kind of position and something simple in keeping with my strategy of not getting anything complex in the last few rounds. And if he had gone e5 for the Sveshnikov, I had also prepared some, minor deviations on the main lines that shouldn't offer much, but I felt would get a fairly risk-free position for white. But I was quite surprised to see knight to f6 first. This was something that I slightly had an or rather, I guess, or I was surprised here, I guess is the better way of putting it, because I still thought just Sveshnikov was possible, but I was very surprised to see d6, because I really hadn't anticipated the classical Sicilian being part of his repertoire at all. And so already I was kind of thinking on my own from move 6 about exactly what system it was that I wanted to go for. So eventually I decided to just stick with the main lines, even though they do get quite complex. I think this is like an important philosophy that I have and I strongly feel is the right approach. Is that when you get surprised in the opening, or I guess maybe a better way of putting it is when your opponent plays an opening that you don't expect them to play, going for the main lines is often fine. You know, a lot of players feel like they have to be the one to deviate very quickly because if their opponent is going for a surprise opening, they probably have something specific prepared in mind, which is true. That is usually the case. But if you go for the main lines, you know, you're often going for a position that you've seen many times because you have played against this opening in the past, not against them, but presumably you're not just like completely on your own just because they played a different major opening. And they're maybe seeing it for like the first or second time. You know, I'm sure he has like games online with the classical Sicilian. I think we all do. I have many games in the classical Sicilian online, even though I don't think I've ever played it over the board. But if your opponent doesn't have a lot of classical experience in the line, they can very quickly drift into trouble, especially if you just like you don't need to do a violent deviation. You know, you can swap the move order around a little bit. You can go for maybe like the second most challenging line, but you don't need to like, you know, do something creative. Like I don't need to like play like h4 to, or you know, like the fifth most normal move in the position just to try to get them out of theory. So I decided to stick with the main line. We continued down it for a while, and now on move 9, White has his biggest choice, which is to play either f3 or f4. Both are very big systems and both have a lot of theory associated with them. f4 is a sort of attempt to not just gain space in the position. f4 is mostly aimed, perhaps counterintuitively, at controlling the d5 square. Because the idea is that eventually White is going to exchange this bishop for this knight, and Black usually, sometimes he can, but usually isn't going to be able to take with the queen for tactical reasons with the pawn on d6 facing problems. For example, if Black develops a bishop e7 here, the knight moves b5, then after takes, the bishop can't take because it's needed to defend the d6 pawn, and so Black is forced to go ahead and take this with the pawn. So Black has achieved the advantage of the two bishops, but they're extremely passive, and the pawn structure is very, very solid. It offers a lot of protection to the king in the center, but it is severely compromised. You know, the h7 pawn is weak, Black doesn't really have a good space to castle, and White will eventually, perhaps immediately, play the move f5, which is part of the point of playing f4, aimed at obtaining the d5 square for the knight. So if Black were to play the very, very bad move e5, then after knight d5, White is pretty much already winning positionally. This bishop is completely worthless, the pawn structure is now seriously compromised, and we have a very, very beautiful square for the knight that is never going to be able to be contested. So there's a lot of theory in this line. Black sometimes simply gives up the d6 pawn and goes ahead and takes on f6 with a piece anyway. There are a lot of lines, you know, typically after f5, Black will just leave the pawn here, allow the capture on e6 if White does want to go for it, and argue that the center control and the two bishops are relevant. But mostly Black is going to be playing for a very rapid queenside attack. And so there are many, many counterintuitive lines in this opening where Black is giving away sort of all positional considerations, often giving away material, but hoping that the attack on the queenside manifests into what usually results in perpetual, if both sides play correctly. So this is definitely one system that I can go for. I thought that was a very viable choice as well. But in this game, I decided to play f3. And the main reason for doing this was, again, well, first of all, I think most of my games in this line have actually been with f3, over the board at least. So I have a little more experience with the resulting positions, but also White's plan is much simpler. You know, I talked about how counterintuitive the lines get in f4. In f3, the plans are really quite simple. White simply wants to push the pawns down the board, blow up in the king side, and win the game. And for the most part, unless Black does something very, very concrete to stop that, that's exactly what White is going to do. You know, I'm basically pre-moving in my head some order of the moves: g4, h4, bishop e3, g5, h5, g6. And black, because, you know, his pieces are very, very passive, his position's very solid, but it is very passive, doesn't often have a great way to deal with that, and often has to start relying on very concrete tactical tricks to try to interfere with white's plan. So my opponent went ahead and took. Black doesn't have to. Black has other options here. For example, the immediate bishop e7 is a very major line as well. Probably the main line. b5 is possible as well. But the point of knight takes d4 is essentially to prevent white from taking on c6. So for example, if black were to play b5, the main line for white involves taking on c6, bishop takes c6, and dropping this knight back to e2, where it will eventually replace its counterpart on d4 with tempo. And so it gets out of the way of any b4 ideas, which is very useful. The queen is still on d2, which is its best square, usually, in these openings. And so after bishop e7, white, again, has the option of taking on c6. We generally don't do it when black can take back with the pawn, but here taking back with the pawn is just sort of not ideal for very concrete reasons. And so after bishop takes c6, we reach a very, very similar position where eventually black's going to play b5 and we'll respond with knight e2 to d4. So black plays knight d4 often. I think this has been very popular in recent years, just to sort of eliminate any question of this tension. You know, both sides always have to consider, okay, what if white takes on c6? What if black takes on d4? Every move, and this is a very direct approach at saying, okay, like, why are we doing this? Let's just get the decision over with. I can take on d4. Like, I'm going to do it eventually, probably. Let's just get it out of the way. We recapture, of course, and now black played the move bishop to e7, which is very sensible. Black has the alternative of just sort of trying to begin queenside play with rook c8, b5, etc. And if you're inexperienced in this line as white, it's very easy to look at this sort of idea and start to get scared, because the queenside play is coming much quicker than usual. But the main thing to keep in mind is that this attack is not usually going to be serious if black can't bring more pieces into it. You know, right now black is attacking with like a rook and a pawn. Like, are we really going to get checkmated by one rook and one pawn? Probably not. You know, chess is not a game where a rook and a pawn are probably going to checkmate you all that often. So black is eventually going to have to play the moves bishop to e7 and castle to start bringing more pieces into the attack anyway. And so if they're going to do that anyway, they might as well start with it, because sometimes they'd like to put the rook on b8. Sometimes they don't want to play b5. You know, sometimes they'd like to play for d5 instead, with like bishop c6, d5. So bishop e7 is definitely the most flexible. And now white has a big choice again of how to continue his plan. So we talked about, you know, g4, h4, bishop e3, g5, h5 is the ideal plan. But there are some concrete problems with going for it directly. So if white goes g4, which seems very sensible, we're continuing our plan. Black can sort of challenge the king side immediately with the move h5. Since we're not able to push the pawn past it at the moment, the bishop's in the way. And so white is pretty much obligated to take. I mean, we can play bishop e2, which is legal and does have a couple of games, but it sort of defeats the purpose of the opening entirely after takes and probably rook h3. What white's kingside play is not really advancing, and so white often has to sort of change ideas here and go for something in the center maybe, or even playing on the queen side sometimes. Like, the king side is pretty stymied. And so this is a way to play. It's not as crazy as you might think. But it's not... It shouldn't be anything special for white. I think black is very clearly equalizing. So generally, white takes, trying to open the g-file. And now white's idea is that black apparently can't take with the knight because of tactics on the d6 pawn. So if black goes ahead and takes with the rook, then white will follow up with h4, and then eventually the moves bishop e2 and f4 are going to be played, evicting the rook, and then white will continue with h5, h6, as was his idea. Just sort of opening the king side, probably bringing the other rook to the g-file, and black is very, very hard-pressed to find a sort of reasonable response to ideas of this form. White's plan is very, very straightforward, and black has to figure out, is still well left with challenges of how to stop it. But it turns out that black has tactical resources as well, and actually can take with the knight. This is all very well-known theory, because after takes, if white does take on d6, which seems to be a free pawn, then at the end of the line, black has this very nice tactical trick, knight g3, exploiting the pin on the h-file. White is forced to move the rook, and after takes on h2, it's actually black who ends up better in the endgame. With a very, very healthy bishop now. It's still passive, but it will activate very quickly against a knight that really doesn't have any scope. And a very, very easy mechanism of creating a passed pawn. I think this endgame is actually extremely difficult for white to play, even though objectively it's still very, very drawable. So after the exchanges, white white can't take on d6 and needs to come up with something else to do. One option is rook to g1, taking advantage of the g-file. One option is queen to b4. I'm trying to put pressure on the b7 pawn, but these lines have sort of all been worked out to not a whole lot for white. So white usually continues with the move h4 instead, starting with h4, hoping to play h5, and then continue with g4. And now if black continues with h5, after h4 trying to stymie the queenside play, now, or the kingside play rather, now it does temporarily stop the advance of the pawns, but it's not resolving the problems forever in the way that it would after g4. So white can continue with simple moves like bishop to e2 just developing. Black is still not really able to castle because h5 has sort of permanently weakened his kingside. And white has a very pleasant choice of slowly preparing g4 as one option, or going for something in the center with f4, e5 is the other plan, and both are quite powerful. So after h5, black generally continues with queen c7. Just not really for any concrete reason. The queen is just particularly well placed on g7. Now again, if g4, black can respond with h5 with very, very similar ideas. Notably, queen c7 does also defend the d6 pawn, so once again, black is able to take with the knight, and the king in the center is actually extremely safe. So h4 remains the main line. There's some deeper stuff there, but this is where I felt would be the moment to deviate, if anything. King to b1 is also a very major main line, just sort of waiting for black to commit to something and then starting to go for the kingside play. But I decided to go for a sort of interesting move, bishop to e3, which at first glance looks extremely strange. Like, why did we develop our bishop to g5 if we were just going to develop it back to e3 anyway? Like, why didn't we start with that back on move 6? Which is a very fair question. And the main answer is that if we go bishop to e3 here, there's sort of concrete problems completing the development. First of all, black can play knight g4, and our best move probably is to go to g5 anyway, or take on c6 is, I guess, possible as well. But knight g4 is like very, very unpleasant, and it's not like the knight orf where we can simply go back, because after queen to b6, there's immediate pressure on the d4 knight. So that's one concrete reason we don't play bishop e3 here. But you might ask, okay, why not play f3 then? With a very similar idea. And the main reason is that this allows black to get a very, very natural setup. With e5, the knight moves, bishop comes to e6, other bishop comes to e7. And black basically gets like the knight orf kind of setup without having had to commit the pawn to a6. So he's basically up a tempo on what you might call a main line of the knight orf. It's still a serious way of playing. You know, white is certainly not worse. White can play for advantage here. Oftentimes in the knight orf, white is wasting time anyway just to get a setup like this, as we saw Hikaru play in the candidates last year. But bishop g5 does sort of force e6. And so you can argue that we haven't actually lost any time by going back to e3. If they ever played e5, we'd basically be reaching a good version of that setup without any tempi loss, since both sides have wasted a move. And bishop to e3 gets out of the way. So now white is very seriously brandishing the threat of just playing g4. So if black plays a move like b5, which my opponent did, and is extremely natural, then after g4, now there is no h5, because we simply push past it. And, well, here we're actually just winning, but even if we weren't, even if this pawn was somehow defended, then after just like, f4 or h4, this structure is extremely good for white. Black's pieces are not participating, and white is going to eventually crash through. So the correct move for black here, they pretty much have to play the move h5. It's really the only thing they can do, because they have to interfere with this plan. And then, the game continues. We probably, once again, play king b1, queen c7, maybe queen back to d2. It's not like h5 kills the line or anything. White still has plenty of ways to continue the game, but h5 is probably required. But it is a committal decision, because black would like to castle the king. That even with a very solid central formation, black does want to castle eventually, mostly to get this rook into the game. And once the pawn is on h5, it's very, very difficult to justify castling, because, for example, if we say h5, king b1, castle, now white is very, very happy to play the move h3, preparing g4. If the king were in the center, black would respond to this with h4, trying to lock down the king side. This is a very typical idea in some, it's often a typical idea on the queen side, like if the pawns are on a3 and b2, to play a4 in some d4 openings, to prevent the advance of the pawn due to en passant. But here, with the king on the g file, white is very, very happy to allow en passant and the breaking of the structure, because, more importantly, we're opening lines. So after, castling is, again, not really possible, and after queen c7, we can also, I mentioned queen d2, but h3 is a very serious idea, just playing for g4 eventually anyway. And so if you're facing this position as black for the first time, which I suspected he would, bishop e3 is extremely uncommon and probably not very good, objectively speaking. H5 is, looking at it from the black side, h5 doesn't look so obvious. I'm sure he considered the move, but it doesn't seem clear that it accomplishes anything. If white plays for bishop e2, h3, g4, then it's not like we've shut down the king side forever. And if we haven't shut down the king side forever, advancing pawns on the king side looks very dangerous. So my opponent played b5, which, a question mark I think is a bit harsh, but it does give black severe challenges going forward, because now after g4, which I played, again, white's plan is basically on autopilot. I'm pre-moving h4, h5, g5 in my mind, and black needs to find some way to stop it, which really isn't that easy. It's very, very difficult to suggest something. I had this position once in a blitz game against the first American chess player, Hans Niemann. I believe he played e5, queen to d2, b4. Actually, I think he played b4 here first, which was a bit of a bluff. I could just take it, but in blitz I played knight e2, which was a bit safer. And then after e5, queen d2, I think he played queen a5, king b1, and then bishop to e6 would have given him a game. He played bishop c6, I think, which didn't really make sense to me. But I ended up very, very quickly blundering. I think the game continued h4, rook c8, and then I didn't see the idea, allowed knight takes c4, and ended up losing quickly. But knight g3 here, defending the e4 pawn, would have basically been winning. So I did have that in mind when I got this position. I don't think I really remembered it going into this position, but once I saw this position, I remembered that this had occurred. And so I thought that my opponent might go for probably not b4, because this is classical. I think, you can't really do such speculative things there, but e5 I thought was very likely, and after queen d2, b4, knight e2, bishop e6, this is what I was mainly calculating. King to b1, probably d5, g5, d4, and we reached some interesting lines. So this is what I was anticipating, something along these lines. But my opponent played the move bishop to c6 while I was still sort of thinking about it. And once again, I didn't really understand this move. To be honest, I still don't. It's not really clear to me what the bishop does on c6, especially as opposed to, like, if you consider the bishop on c6 versus the bishop on e6, the bishop on e6 has quite a bit of scope. You know, we're putting pressure on a2. It also supports d5. The bishop on c6 doesn't really do anything. I mean, technically it does support d5, but with the bishop on c6, this isn't really a move we want to play. White is going to be very happy to push past it with e5. And the bishop doesn't, like, there's no threat on e4. There's no sort of reason to believe that black can sacrifice a piece or anything. And so I really wasn't sure what my opponent was going for. I eventually played h4 fairly quickly, just continuing with the plan. It might have been slightly more accurate to play g5 first, but I didn't think there was going to be a big difference, and h4 would sort of ask the question, you know, what are you doing? Like, what is your plan here? And so my opponent spent a little bit more time, played the move queen to a5. Again, I didn't really see the point. I mean, there is the obvious threat of b4, trying to kick the knight and take the a2 pawn, but that's very easy to defend against, and so I played king b1 again quite quickly. And sort of once again asked black what his idea was. And here my opponent spent a fair amount of time again, so it's possible that he had some idea here that didn't end up working. Possibly d5 was his intention, and then like he saw g5 was a problem. I'm not entirely sure. But in any case, he played the move h6, which I think, again, a question mark is very harsh. This is at least a way to try to contest the king side. It does stop g5 immediately, because after takes, there's a pin on the h-file. And so this was the first moment of the game where I spent some serious time thinking, and I came up with what I thought was a very, very nice move, bishop to h3. The move has two purposes, which is why I was happy to play it. One is it blocks the h-file, so now g5 is possible. And the second is that even though this bishop looks very strangely placed on h3, you know, we're just staring at a pawn, once I do play g5, it's going to be staring at this e6 pawn, which might still look like we're staring into a wall. But if we get g5, g6 in, it starts to undermine the king-side structure quite heavily, and the attack on the pawn at e6 certainly becomes quite relevant. Furthermore, if black does go for e5, which I thought was very logical, now there is no rook c8 ever, because this bishop on h3 very crucially protects this, and so bishop h3 is partially aimed at limiting black's counterplay on the c-file. Here we'd have g5 with the win of material. But my opponent had the second idea of h6 was to kick the knight and then play the move g5, using the queen on a5 as a lateral defender, which it's a very creative way of trying to slow down the queenside advance, or the kingside advance, and I think in practical terms it was a quite reasonable thing to go for, but it does have a bit of a flaw in that this pawn on b4 is extremely overextended. The queen is on a5, where it blocks the pawn advancing to support it. And so this pawn can pretty much be collected whenever white wants. And I decided to just do it immediately because I didn't see another idea. I played bishop to d2. Now if white is able to take this pawn, not only is white winning a pawn, but the bishop is activating and putting pressure on d6 as well. So my opponent played rook to b8, and now here I went for the immediate a3, which in hindsight I think was a practical mistake. This pawn is pretty much dead. White can collect it whenever. And so a much stronger move that I didn't really consider during the game was just to bring the bishop back to f1, reintroducing the threat of taking because of the pin on the h-file. And after black plays rook to g8, which is basically forced, now after takes a3, there's much less counterplay to worry about, and we are just collecting this pawn very, very comfortably. So this would have been a much better implementation of the idea, but I thought a3 was just winning a pawn. There wasn't really anything to discuss. My opponent played queen to b5, which is basically forced, trying to gain counterplay by attacking the pawn on the knight on e2. But white is able to take the b4 pawn with the queen, and now black doesn't have time to go take this knight because the rook is hanging. So here I thought this was just a clear pawn and pretty much game over. After takes, either way white takes is fine. I think I was probably going to take with the pawn to avoid any d5 stuff. But either way, I mean, white is going to follow up with knight d4. We're up a very, very healthy pawn. Black is still having trouble completing his development. I thought this was a very simple win. Probably I overestimated it a little bit. There's still some work to do. But I thought that white would win very comfortably. So my opponent instead played d5, looking for active counterplay, which I had seen briefly. I hadn't checked it that much, because after the move queen to c3, which I had seen and played, I thought that this was pretty much it. Not really a lot else to look at. Because now if black goes ahead and takes on e2, now we take on c6, and there really isn't any justification for the loss of material. White is up a pawn with more active pieces as well. It's not even like black has better placed pieces for it. And so at this point, I felt like white should just very, very easily be winning with pretty much any move. Maybe bishop to c3 is fine. I think it was probably my main intention, just putting the bishop on the long diagonal. Black can't take on a3 because it's needed to defend the knight. So you pretty much have to play king g7, and then just developing the pieces normally seems like a quite reasonable way to maintain a winning advantage. Computer at this point finds some slightly more accurate approaches. Apparently queen c7 is very strong. Just putting the question to this rook immediately, but I thought bishop c3 was more than good enough. But I did hesitate a little bit before playing queen c3, because I saw at this moment, only at this moment, my opponent's intention of playing the interesting move e5, which for the third time of the game, the computer gives a question mark that I think is quite harsh. I think practically speaking, this is by far black's best try. The idea is just to take large control of the center. d4 is a big threat, and so white is largely forced to take. I could instead play bishop f1, again, an idea that I had missed basically every time it was available. And this was probably much stronger as well. Once again, we're threatening h takes g5 because of the pin on the h file, but we're also setting up a discovery, maybe bringing the knight to f5. And this is very, very difficult for black to deal with. Honestly, I think at this point, this might be close to resignable for black. But after e5, I mostly only looked at takes, which I think was a big mistake. And now after takes, I really overestimated this endgame. White is up a pawn, but now this bishop on h3 being offside is quite relevant. It is not participating in the game at all. And black's pieces are no longer, super terribly placed. If black gets to castle, or, in some way deal with the last remaining issue of this rook and king being mostly observers to the game right now, then black is probably fine. So white is still winning. This is more than good enough, but now white has to be precise. The other option here, instead of bishop f1 and taking, was to play the move a4. This I had spent some time looking at, but I got scared of a specific line here, which was queen to b7, queen takes e5, castle. Now it looks like, everything is collapsing for black. We just take on g5, but the thing that scared me here was the move knight to d7. Queen d4, I think, is forced. Only way to maintain contact with the b2 pawn. I mean, technically we can go to c3, but we want to put a piece on c3, so there's just no reason to ever do that. And now after, I think, bishop to d6, I started to get a little concerned, because now there are pieces flying into the game, and white needs to be a little bit accurate to survive this. If he does survive it, then white's just completely winning, and again, the computer isn't impressed with this attack at all. But there were just like a number of vague lines I was concerned about here. I was also concerned about rook f to c8, trying to give away some stuff. It turns out again that white is able to survive this, but it looks very, very scary. I saw bishop to c3, bishop to a3 here, and just kind of stopped. I didn't see that I could take on d5, which ends a lot of the calculation. But the most convincing way, apparently, to win is to play bishop takes h6, threatening mate, allowing black to take on c2, and moving the king to a1, where there are no checks and there isn't a good way for black to deal with the threat of mate. So concretely, this is all fine, and probably I should have just not been lazy and gone for it, but eventually I decided that this endgame was probably fine because I had miscalculated something here with knight to g3. I thought that I was very cleanly winning this. Black is pretty much forced to take the pawn. And now I went ahead and grabbed g5, which was a big mistake. I did consider bishop to c3 here, just playing for activity. But I thought after takes that I was very comfortably collecting everything here. And I overlooked the move bishop to c6, which, for the 5th time this game, the computer gives a question mark, but I think, practically speaking, is quite reasonable. And here I spent almost all of the rest of my time calculating. And something sort of very strange happened here that I still have a lot of difficulty explaining to myself. So in this position, white is up a pawn technically, but this pawn on f3 is extremely strong. So if black gets another move or two to consolidate, like play rook d8 for example, which apparently is what he was supposed to do on the previous move instead of bishop c6. But if black does manage to get rook to d8 in, then most likely black is going to hold this game. That much I understood. White's main advantage lies not in his extra pawn, but in the fact that the e-file is a very serious problem for black. If I manage to get a rook to the e-file without losing this piece, or allowing f2, then black has some very, very serious problems. And so by far the most natural move in the position is knight f5, which is what I ended up playing. But while I was calculating knight f5, I saw two ways for black to try to defend this position. My threat is rook to e1. The first one that I saw, and so I started calculating it first, was to move knight to e4, putting pressure on this bishop and sacrificing a piece, but hoping to take advantage of this pin on the b file. And so I started calculating bishop e7 is the most logical move. Knight to c3 check, king to c1, knight takes d1. And now we're not able to recapture, because if rook d1, just rook h3, and there's no mate or anything, no way to generate a threat here, we're just kind of down material for nothing. If we play king takes d1, then f2, and we have very, very serious problems. And so after knight takes d1, we have to find a completely different move, like moving the bishop away. Probably c5 to cover f2. Knight takes b2, bishop to d4, forking the rook and the knight. But here I saw the very powerful move f6, and I wasn't really sure how to continue, because now this gives the king just enough breathing room that rook e1 is not really a big threat. And after bishop takes f6, rook h7, I didn't see a very serious follow-up here. Again, if we go ahead and take, then black has this very important f2 move. So I spent quite a lot of time trying to deal with this knight e4 move, and eventually I concluded that I can take with the knight. Black can't go ahead and take the bishop because we're also attacking black's bishop, so black is forced to just move the bishop back, which still looks very scary because there's a double threat of the attacking g5 and also knight c3. But it turns out that I have this very nice move rook e1. And the point is that after takes knight to d5, we cut off the defense of the knight by the bishop. And we are basically just winning a piece here, which I thought should be enough to win. I wasn't 100% sure. After takes, it turns out that black has a defense that I missed, which is king to f8. White can go ahead and take, but it's a little dangerous because we are giving... We will end up having to give an exchange back for the pawn. And so we'll end up with a bishop and two pawns for the rook, which is reasonably still a winning attempt, but not convincing. It turns out that we can throw in this move bishop to e7, which is very nice. And now if takes, the king moves, we very comfortably stop this pawn. We remain up a pawn and probably collecting a second one. So black is forced to move the king. And now after takes, we are once again giving an exchange, but it's a much better version, because after takes g5, we get to put the bishop on f6, and white is still not technically winning. The computer finds ways to defend, but practically speaking, I think this is very, very difficult for black to play. The c-pawn is just running down the board, and it's very, very difficult to stop. So eventually I concluded that knight e7 should be enough to work. So then I started thinking about, okay, what happens if f2? Which he ended up playing. And as you can see, the bar has completely shot up, which should indicate that there is a problem. But I initially started calculating rook to f1, which again, you can see is not correct. I did end up playing it, which I'll explain in a moment. And the idea is that after rook takes f2, if we're threatening the knight on f6, which is pinned, so black needs to defend it. For rook to f3, we just take on f6, follow up with rook f1, and we have an easily winning rook endgame. If he blocks with bishop to f3, we do exactly the same thing. Take, and then just rook to f1. This did give me a little bit of pause, because I was originally looking at takes and rook f1 immediately, but after bishop g4, black should probably hold this endgame. It's still chances for white, because we're up a pawn, but with the opposite color bishops, it's quite difficult. But eventually I saw that after f2, I don't need to play rook f1. It looks like we kind of have to, because our rook is attacked. But I have a very nice tactical intermezzo, bishop to g2. Now we're attacking both the rook and the bishop, importantly with check. So if black goes ahead and takes on h1, we can take, give check, and just come back and take the rook. The pawn is not promoting. We just won a piece for nothing. So I saw this bishop g2 move, and then I went back to calculating knight e4, because it was, again, very complicated. I spent a lot of time. Eventually decided that it should work. And so I went ahead and played knight f5. My opponent almost immediately, if I remember correctly, played the move f2, which, keep in mind, I knew was losing, but I haven't looked at it in a while, because I mostly focused on knight e4, and so I was very surprised to see f2. And for some reason, I don't really have a very good explanation to share, possibly because I had spent the vast majority of the time looking at f2, rook f1, I just very quickly, after f2, I very quickly checked, oh yeah, rook f1 takes on e7, takes on f2, I win. I remember looking at this. And so I played rook f1 very, very quickly, I think, upon, I remember just kind of like sitting back down at the board and just like immediately playing rook f1 and then being like, wait, why did I do that? And it turns out that there is a very, very big problem here, which is that after takes, here I started spending a lot of time because, well, I started with 18 minutes, so how much? I spent 6 minutes on this. Obviously, I'm not calculating anything here. I have to take on e7. I was mostly just beating myself up. Like, why didn't I just play bishop g2 and win the game? Because now I realized, or, well, I kind of already realized, but after knight takes e7, black doesn't have to take back with the king. Black can instead play the very important move bishop to f3, instead attacking the rook and making very serious threats of this f2 pawn promoting. So for example, if white goes ahead and plays a move like rook d3, now the idea from before is a big problem of knight e4. Also rook h1, for that matter, is probably even simpler. Now after takes, we simply can't stop this pawn from queening. Rook to d1. Even bishop to g2 is probably fine, but bishop f3 and knight e4 is even more to the point. This knight is just too stranded. So, I mean, at this point, I kind of understood that I was probably going to lose the game after rook takes h3. So, in one move, I went from, completely winning to probably not completely losing. I mean, I sort of guessed that I'm probably technically supposed to hold, but I wasn't expecting to be able to do it with very low time. So after bishop f3, I was hoping to find something better, but I took on f6 and ended up taking on f2. I don't know why the computer gives that a question mark. It also says it's the best move. So I don't know what the computer is doing here. The other thing I had considered a little bit was trying to play knight to f5 here, but there isn't really a very good reason to do that after rook f3, bishop h4, bishop e2. This is just a worse version. Takes. So I think there was one other thing I was considering here. Oh yeah, I was also considering rook takes d1, rook f3, rook f1 takes, and knight f5. This would be a much improved version because now, I mean, if we do take this, we have 2 pawns for the exchange, and we can even consider like trying to play. Most likely we don't get that. We end up with 1 pawn for the exchange, but this is much easier to hold with a set of liners off. But the main problem is that black doesn't go for rook f3, but goes instead for rook g3, as tries to promote the pawn from the side, and it turns out there's not really any way to stop that. If bishop to d4, trying to go after the pawn, then again, black doesn't need to deal with that immediately, or take the knight immediately. He can just play rook to d8. And we are not able to defend everything. So eventually I decided, okay, I just have to take on f2. Black took on g4. And now we began a very long defense that isn't really super interesting. Black is trying to convert. If black ever gets a pair of rooks off, then it's a very, very easy conversion. Also, if black ever gets to push to f-pawn, it's a very easy conversion. So my defense is sort of oriented around trying to keep this blockade, which I did manage to do for a few moves, but it should never happen permanently. And eventually it broke down. Here I played rook d6, which was not a very good defense, but I don't think I had much of an alternative. The thing that I was trying to go for here with rook to d6 is that if black, sort of lollygags around for a while, probably not there because bishop e5, but like if black passes for a couple moves, then yeah, if we manage to get this set up with knight e7 and bishop to a5, then suddenly it's very difficult for black's king to escape this prison. All of the squares on the c-file are very well controlled, and we're threatening to go check and knight to c6, boxing the king in completely. At this point, white's probably actually playing for a win, if we manage to get that, but unfortunately we don't get the time for that. My opponent played a precise move rook to f2, and now if we do go knight e7, then black will simply put pressure on the c2 pawn, and we're a move off of getting the setup we were hoping for. It probably would have been better to start with knight e7 if I was going to do that. Also a little subtler. Like if black had tried to move rook to f3, then after bishop a5, there isn't really a good way to stop this, and white is surviving. But I didn't like to move rook to h5 here, controlling the a5 square, and I felt at this point I can't maintain this blockade any longer. The f6 square, and black is just going to follow up with f5 and running the pawn. So I tried to start with rook d6 to be trickier. It's not really any trickier. Black can still play rook h5, and here I thought, okay, at least I'm controlling the f6 square still, but it's not much. But after rook f2, there isn't really much to discuss. I have to play bishop d2 to try to defend the second rank. But after rook h2, king c1, you can give the checks, you cannot, doesn't really make a difference. The main point is I will never be able to play bishop a5 because we will always need the bishop on the second rank to block the c-pawn. And as long as my pieces are frozen, there's no good way of stopping the f-pawn just running down the board. So he played probably an overly fancy way of doing it, but anything works. And then eventually I had to go for, I thought that black was going to pre-move king c7 against most moves, probably rook f2 first, I guess, to stop any bishop f4, but I played this, which is technically a mistake, and then went for a very concrete line, but the concrete line works out very well for black, who ends up picking up a second rook in the game. So this was a very, very frustrating one, obviously. Going from completely winning to completely losing in one move is a very, very difficult thing to deal with, especially when you saw the completely winning move. And like, if I didn't realize it during the game, then maybe that maybe I would have put up better resistance in the exchange down endgame. I probably still would have lost, but if ignorance is bliss, and when you make very, very large blunders like this. So I would have actually preferred not to have realized it, but once you realize such a thing, it's very, very, very difficult to psychologically recover. And so I was kind of fortunate that I think this endgame is probably objectively lost. If it were objectively drawn, I would have like actually had to put focus on it, but since it was objectively lost, I was able to at least just be like, all right, let's just go for the motions and get out of here. With this loss, we moved to our first minus score of the tournament, 3 out of 7, which was quite disappointing. One of my first minus scores in one of these round robins in quite a long time, so I was very, very unhappy. And this also sort of eliminated any chances of this being a good tournament. You know, +1, even if I won both my remaining games, which was never really going to happen, but if I finished with like an even or a +1 score, I still wouldn't be very happy. You know, it would be fine. I wouldn't be like super mad at it. I'd even gain some rating, so it's hard to be like super upset, but I wouldn't be like, I wouldn't come out of this tournament with like a +1 score or an even score, more likely, and be and you know, feel good about my performance. I also knew that the next 2 games I was going to have were going to be quite difficult, because in round 8 we were going to play a player who needed to win. With I would have the black pieces against a player that needed to win for a norm, so he was obviously going to try quite hard. And in the final round, I was going to have white against a very, very strong player who hasn't lost a game in like years, or well, probably not years, but a lot of games. I was told he was on like a 50 plus game unbeaten streak. So I wasn't really, you know, I wasn't really expecting to even get back to even, let alone +1, which I wouldn't be satisfied with anyway. And so at this point, I figured, well, if my best case scenario is, you know, -1, like maybe even, that's very, very bad. So it's definitely at this point, I pretty much hit my low point of the tournament. And so even though, as we'll see, I ended up losing another game from a winning position, at that point it was like, okay, well, whatever. This is just apparently my life now. But this one kind of stung, and I'm kind of over it now, but I'm also not, you know. This one broke me, as they say. All right, but anyway, this was round 7. This was a long one because this was another quite complicated game. Somehow, despite my strategy of simplifying the game in the last few rounds, we ended up in one of the messier games of the tournament anyway. But I will see you all next time for round 8 of this tournament, which, spoiler alert, was not much better than this one. Thank you all for watching.